The following episode is a rebroadcast from a previous BLAW Live. For the next several weeks, we will be presenting an encore presentation of Bishop Lawrence Ward's series on biblical justice. This week, part 2 of the Call for Biblical Justice with Chris Nichols. We hope you enjoy the discussion.
What do you think is going to happen long term? Because as you said, it's not going to be a short term fix. Long term, 5 to 10 years from now, if you kind of peer into the future, what do you think is going to happen? Is this going to just be another really good rally feeling moment, or is this going to cause us to really make some change? And what would that look like?
Well, I'd love to say, yeah, I'm sure it's going to bring a lot of change, but I'm really old and I've seen this come round and round and round. And so it's really discouraging to me. I don't want to be a naysayer, but I just, I don't know. I think, I think there's a possibility that in some places around the country, there could be changes in the police force. I know that's a lot is happening. One of our pastors, one of our Black pastors here, is on the civilian commission overseeing the police, and he's one of the co-chairs. We have our police chief is Black, and she's finally, I think, getting the support she needs to try to bring real change to the police force here. It's really tough. So I think it's a possibility there could be some of that change. Unless, I don't want to become overly political here, but unless we make a radical change in our national government, we are going to continue to find someone who is creating separation, division, and opportunity for people to hide behind their own racism. That has to change. I think it's critical that it change locally, professionally. I think COVID-19 is giving us more opportunity to make changes in the education system and that we're operating in multiple ways that we even know. And so that we have more flexibility now to make changes in how we understand discipleship, how we understand evangelism. So I just was talking to our directors yesterday, presenting with James Chung's gospel outline, the big story, because it allows you to understand how Jesus has come to reclaim us so that he might redeem the world. It allows justice to be an intimate part of the gospel. So I think in the church, we need to change how we talk about the gospel and evangelism. We shouldn't withdraw from evangelism, because the only way this possibly can change if people have a deep conversion experience. I am not on the side of the church that thinks, well, we just need to have some more social activism. We're just going to burn ourselves out, but we need to be engaged with the Jesus. Our pastor preached this incredible sermon last Sunday out of the raising of Lazarus. And he said, if you want to know where Jesus is at the grave raging. He's with his friends weeping. He's on the streets marching. He's beyond the grave rising. And as I look at how we think about the gospel outlines, how we teach about evangelism, I think COVID-19, and this is our opportunity, if you have any authority in the church at all, this is the way we begin to make those changes.
Wow. This is another question that comes about. They said the question is, I'm in an interracial marriage, both very strong in our faith, okay, but needing some assistance in discussing the anger and the hurt that the country is feeling right now. And so where can we begin to discuss how to deal with this spiritually?
Well, yeah. I'm sorry that my answers are so convoluted. I mean, I just don't think there are any easy answers, but
there are none. This is the tension points for all of us as leaders. It's just a lot of tension points.
Yeah. Well, I think for one thing, Um, I think, so I know a number of interracial couples at our church, and I think you have to get to a place where you're saying, this is how I feel. This is what it feels like in this moment. And without, it's the great communication skills, right? Rather than saying you shouldn't feel that way, but this is how I feel at this moment. So that we can figure out where we're starting from. Because it's hard to go to a spiritual place if don't know what we're bringing into the spiritual conversation. I think for lots of Christians, they want to go to a spiritual conversation. They think they can leave themselves behind, but that just sneaks in and erupts in the conversation. So I think to say, this is how this feels right now. This is what I'm thinking. This is what my experience is. And to have listening patterns, which is going to be very familiar to you.
Yep.
So it may be that one person speaks, there's 30 seconds of silence, the other person reflects what they're hearing the other person say, there's 30 seconds of silence, the other person speaks, so that at least you're hearing each other. Then I would say that for a couple, an interracial couple, for whatever the lighter skinned person is, if they're white, that I think they need to find a white mentor who understands these issues so they don't go to their spouse for education. So if there's the black person, if there's a black and white couple, the African-American, the African, the dark-skinned person in that marriage, they can't be the educator for their spouse.
Well,
Spouse needs to be listening and engaging, but that person needs a mentor who can help them interpret what's going on, and they can say things in that context that would be incredibly hurtful to their spouse. I think that's really important. The other thing I'd say is that I want to go back to the question of lament. I think we need to know how to weep and wail and cry together. Deep empathy for how messed up this is. I just don't know how, unless we get there, it's just so hard to have these conversations. And then I think there may be conversations couples could have, set questions about, tell me about your experience. Tell me about your personal history. What's this like for you in this moment? So you can share an experience and really listen to each other. That's not very helpful, but a few steps maybe that could help.
Thank you. That's really good. That's really good. Thank you. So please keep the questions coming. If you have a question, we only have about 20 minutes left. I'm going to sneak a question in here while they're typing in. You know my sons. You know both of my sons. You talked to both of my sons, and one of the things that my wife and I, Virginia, has done, we have to talk to our kids a lot about how to be a Black man in America. How to be a Black man in America. And I know that as young people are being raised in their families, and I'm wondering, is the conversation going to need to change? Or is the conversation going to remain the same? My sons are now 28, 30. And one thing that Paul said that I was really hoping that he'd be wrong to the core. When they asked the question, and we did an interview on WGBH, a short interview with our family, and he was asked the question, do you think that body cameras and having and filming the police, if they should stop you, is going to change anything with regard to police brutality? He said no. He said because eventually they're going to be able to film a police officers killing us in the street. He said that 5 years ago. And when he said that, I called him and I said, I'm so sorry. I didn't want you to be right, but I thought we were way beyond this. So what do we tell? Is the narrative going to change when we're going to tell our young people, our young Black men and women, you got to watch out because they're out to get you?
Well, this is the one I think that haunts me a lot. every time I see a Black man or woman killed, I think about Paul and Mark, because they're just a couple years younger than my sons, and we've lived kind of parallel lives, right?
Yep.
So growing up in the church, our sons all went to elite schools, all graduated, all working, all responsible, all doing really well. I never had to talk to my white sons about being white in America. And every time I see something happen, I think about Paul and Mark living for fear what might happen to them. So one of the things that's happening that I could be a hope for change, I have two grandsons who are 5 and 3. And their parents have just asked us to recommend chapter books about boys and girls of color, so that their son can read books in his shelf that are about kids who don't look like him. It's really critical. So we just had 7 books arrive. We're reading through them, try to look and think what would be helpful to him. He has a cousin, my daughter-in-law's brother's wife is Black. So he has cousins who are Black. So it's critical that my grandsons understand these issues now when they're 5 and 3. I think it's critical at church that we tell stories, that we try to understand how we begin to build bridges in our children, give them a greater awareness. But I think we have to attack this issue from multiple sides. And I think so from the kind of older side is that we attack it from both what we provide for places where we have authority, training, education, where we vote, where we have influence, demanding some kind of change. But I also think we have to work to protect young Black men particularly, until the day when we can be reassured somehow that they're in a safe space. I don't know what the answer is. It does terrify me. It really does. And
it is terrifying, because at the same time, I'm trying to make sure I stay alive.
Exactly. Well, that's the other thing. So you're worried about your sons, and now every time you get in a car, so one of the elders at our church is African American. He's an engineer at Boeing. So we were in the conversation last week, and he was saying that, but I don't know, 3 months ago, probably less, he was driving, well, it was before COVID, so it was probably 5 months ago. He was driving down to Boeing. It's probably a 20-minute drive for him. 4:30 in the morning. He stopped by 4 police cars.
Wow.
He always wears his Boeing insignia. So it's the routine. Wallet and keys on the dash, hands on the dash. The guy is a senior engineer at Boeing. They said the only thing he could think of was, it's too dark for anyone to film. That's just gut wrenching, right? So I'm almost speechless. I don't know, how do you help our children survive when our friends need to survive, when every time, so I don't know what that answer is. We obviously can't stop, but it's horrifying. I don't know.
Yeah. But thank you for trying to answer that question. Here's a question that came up in the chat box. It says, can we move toward truly multi-ethnic worship communities, given the need for repentance and education from white folks and healing for Black people and other POCs? Like this question. And with such different needs, and how can we really come together and honestly? So that's a question that comes up. How can that really happen?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, I think there's a certain level of idealism in me that would like to believe that we can have truly multicultural, multi-ethnic churches. And I think what is possible is that we can have one culturally dominant space that actually makes room for other people and recognizes their presence and allows their presence to be known and influence the system. I think we're always going to need multicultural, single ethnic communities. So I know that Abundant Life is actually a multicultural community. It's a single ethnic community in some ways, but it's a multicultural community. We're going to continue to need those spaces. But what we do in those spaces is really critical. I think we can be multiculturally sensitive. I think we should be able to read the scriptures from really an international lens, a sense of understanding what God is doing at a broad base, seeing where ethnicity and race fits into the scriptures. We need to be able to continue to teach about justice in all of our churches. But one thing that's been interesting to watch in our kindred partnerships is that we have these three churches: African American, white dominant, Chinese dominant. All those churches have some multi-ethnic mix in them. But when you're coming together for folks where one player is trying not to be dominant, then you have a space where people can actually have conversation and build relationship. That's been really helpful. So one of the things that's been interesting when I did this research project with young Black professionals, that many of them had left multicultural churches, multi-ethnic churches, big churches, because they realized over time that the church actually wasn't multicultural, that it was representational, but it wasn't multicultural.
Right.
And it just became exhausting. And so most of the Black men I knew went into Black churches. Now, that's not to say that there's obviously a huge range of the Black experience. And so I know lots of Black men who are raised in a more diverse environment or white environment, and they're more comfortable in that. And that's fine. I'm just saying that let's not pretend what it is and what it isn't. So there may be a day, but I think we need to keep working toward teaching what we know is true in the scriptures, even if our churches remain mono-ethnic or at least monocultural.
Yeah, that's great. It's one of the things that I've kind of just going to even just toss out to you, that I think that it's important that we as believers in Christ see that the scriptures have to find its way back to be authoritative.
Yes.
I don't believe the church that we have now in terms of Big C church, everybody believes that the scriptures that everybody believes that they're authoritative.
That's right.
In many respects, that we all understand that we're coming under the lordship of Christ. And to some degree, we have gotten distracted with a lot of social action-oriented activities to the, kind of tossing aside the importance of discipleship, transformation of the life of the believer, and how does that work itself, our faith in life, how does that connect to every area of our lives? And so I think the church has some work to do, and we have some work to do as pastors to bring people back to, let's understand these scriptures are authoritative, and when we don't come under the submission of Christ, bad things happen.
Yep.
Like
absolutely. Absolutely. And that should be a warning to us. A warning to us. There's a prophetic word in that. Bad things happen when you don't put yourself under the authority of Christ, because then you're under your own authority, or you're giving way to the evil one. And those bad things will always happen in that direction. There's hope for redemption under the lordship of Christ. There is no hope of redemption without that.
That's good. So let's look at, if you have any more questions. I'm sorry, I didn't realize that POC is people of color. Okay, so they interpreted that for me. Not a good guy sometimes with acronyms, you know what I'm saying?
I understand.
So here's a question. The next generation is attempting to lead this movement. What do you see for the other generations? That is a very good question.
Well, let me. There's a particular challenge. So I think every generation has its own challenge, right? So I think what I've noticed in our church, so we're a relatively big church, 2,300 people, skews to the older side. I've noticed that some of the oldest people in the church have been the most open to change. I think they feel like they have less to hang on to.
Mm.
It's the folks in their mid 40s to mid 50s that are struggling the hardest. They're either white progressives who are determined that Jesus fit their social agenda and enable them to live exactly the way they're living, or they're hyper conservative and they want Jesus to bless their social agenda and encourage them to live the same way they're living.
Wow.
Notice how those two ends of that spectrum look exactly the same.
Yeah.
So I think it's when the folks who have power and money, and I'm speaking from the white perspective here, they're the ones who are going to have the hardest time. I think the younger generation, there are two things. One is that they've grown up in a more diverse world generally, right? High school, elementary school, college, that's to the advantage. And they lived in a global world to some extent. Huge advantage. Disadvantage. That younger generation that's trying to lead that movement often is relatively biblically illiterate. And so they simply take on the culture around them and try to Christianize, just like their parents. It's just the religious end of the other end of the spectrum. How do we help that generation become deeply biblically grounded with deep humility to lead this thing further? Thirdly, that generation is going to need access, they're going to need money, they're going to need time. So for those of us who are older, how do we make space for them to both receive the education, the space they need, the salary they need, the position they need to make a change? The mistake we mustn't make is believing that just because you're a certain age gives you, especially when you're young, exceeding wisdom. It also doesn't mean you're stupid. So there needs to be a balance there. But here's the danger. The radicals of the 60s and 70s became the conservatives of the 80s and 90s.
Wow.
The people who were protesting the Vietnam War, they were out marching in the streets, they were burning in Watts. They became the folks that moved out to the suburbs and became conservative because they just burned out. We don't want this generation to simply become agitators without something to sustain them. So how do we sustain them with something deep in the gospel that will help them run the race to the end? And how do we keep running with them? So
wow. That's mind-blowing, because it's kind of what I constantly was talking to a number of young people about, that this isn't just the incident. This has been a story. You're part of a story that goes forward, and hopefully you'll see it sometime where it's not going to be the same thing over and over again.
yeah.
But I'm not, you know, Sean was talking about that last week, where he was very concerned because he didn't know if they had enough stamina.
Yeah.
If there was enough stamina and there was enough stick-to-itiveness. And Al Sharpton also made comments about that today. He said, there's a whole lot of people on camera. There's a whole lot of people marching. He said, but when they start seeing how long it may take for even, you know, sentencing these police officers, that could be a long process right now. And will they still be there, or will the numbers dwindle? Will they be there? You know, and remember, they're the ones that held up the signs and stood for hours.
Yeah.
But yet, over time, you know, it just kind of dissipated and went back to nothing.
And I think we partly have to be the people to keep cheering them on, giving them the depth, saying, come stand with us, we'll come stand with you, to sustain that.
It's good. But for those of you who are here, we got 2 more minutes. Thank you so much for being a part of this conversation. Chris, I want to thank you for being a part of this conversation. We're going to try to pick this up again next week. And guess what? We're going to have Dr. Nicole Martin on.
One of my favorite people in the whole world.
Yeah,
Fantastic.
Dr. Martin's going to be on next week. And I think she's gonna do a really bang up job, super job. You did a great job. Sean did a great job, and I'm glad that our paths cross. I want to thank my wife for really helping us get together, and Tonya, thank you so much for being a part of this consistent effort to help us in the technology area. And all of you tonight, thank you so much for being a part of this. And let's keep our dialogue going. But remember, pray. We are God, Jesus disciples, and so we have a high calling. We do have a God that's able to change hearts, and so we don't want to lose hope. We don't want to come to a position where we just say it is hopeless, because God said He can do all things, and there's nothing impossible with God. So we're still in the fight. We're still going to stay encouraged. Pray with others, encourage others, and those that need an example, be the example for them. And I just want to thank you again, Reverend Nichols, for being a part of this wonderful discussion tonight. And so,
My pleasure. It was a privilege to be here.
I want you to hang around for a bit. So we want to say goodnight to everybody. Thank you so much for being a part of it. God bless. Have a good evening, everyone, and be safe. Bye-bye.